So I'm currently in Singapore attending the Singapore FinTech Festival. And of course, I am also taking the opportunity to speak with Mastercard regarding their recent partnership and rollout of their FinTech Express, a solution where they want to use when they want to partner with FinTech players. And in this conversation with Rama Sridhar, the Executive Vice President of Digital as well as Emerging Partnerships, Rama and I spoke about the kind of need for Mastercard to build and forge new partnerships with fintech players, because if you think about it, Mastercard have been in the payment space for decades, and the partnerships that they've had with banks over the years have indeed been strong and fruitful. So why do they need to engage with fintech players right now when it comes to disrupting the fintech space? Here is my conversation with Rama Sridhar of Mastercard. All right, so let's take it from the top. Mastercard and the strategic partnerships that you're building. Number one is why do you need to build strategic partnerships? What's wrong with building things on your own?
Why do I need to build strategic partnerships? Yeah. In the end, the world goes to ground because every discrete sector operates in a certain way and they deliver to what they are set up for. Each one of us has a core competence, but in the digital world in particular, transactions happen when people interact across the ecosystem. It's very important that players come together in order to create the value for their clients, whether they be consumers or whether they be business houses, it does not matter. Building software by itself does not land business. Partnerships ensure that we have reached or created access to vast consumer pools who may be resident in various of these potential partners, if you like, brought across solutions that may be resident in either them or somewhere else, and created added the value that Mastercard actually would add. So partnerships, I think, is crucial. It's the way of growing business for us going forward. Even in the past, we were partnering primarily with banks. Now we have extended the scope of our partnerships.
That's exactly my question. Actually, my follow-up question was: so you have partnered with banks for decades. Why has things changed now to a point where you have to start to look at, say, startups, for instance, or payment startups? What's the dynamic change of you building more partners than you already have before?
No, that's an excellent question, right? So about 3 years back, we took a huge step back and we said, in continuing to stay reasonably focused just on the banking sector, what is happening in the economy and how is that likely to play out for Mastercard? If you look at what's happening in the economy, the lift in digital transactions is being triggered, and not just by the banks, right? It is being triggered by a lot of the technology platform players. It is being triggered on mobile devices. It is being triggered on apps which are not necessarily banking apps. And so if you look at that collectively, it basically means that unless we find a way to engage with all of these players who are creating those digital transactions over a period of time, we may not be participating enough in the growth of transactions itself. That, I think, is the singular shift in thinking, which then caused us to rethink how we want to approach. We continue to be neutral, right? So we're not picking sides. We're saying we'll continue to work with everyone, and we will make our network and our products and solutions also be adapted to cater to the requirements of this sector.
There's also the conversation of, because I still don't want to jump into startups just yet. I still want to talk about your partnerships with traditional, I guess, players, including governments.
Yes.
How's the conversation like with Mastercard, with governments, particularly in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, those kind of stuff?
Again, a good, outstanding question, Ibrahim. You've got some really good questions. So there are two things I want to say about our government engagement. If you look at how our business focus is, there is a traditional engagement with banks. Then there is the growth engagement on the digital side with the partnership players. Our engagement with governments, we just consider governments a key stakeholder for all conversations. In the past, it used to be primarily regulatory policy-oriented conversations. But now governments are the primary driver of digital economies in most markets, right? And so there are components that, in fact, they are the decision makers on, whether that be the digital standards or the frameworks, or real-time payments, which is a huge lift-off for digital payments in many markets. You saw it in Thailand, you're seeing it in India, in Norway it's happened, in UK it's happened. And the third part of it really is how do you create the policy and the incentives and all of that in order to make sure real-time payments is driving up digital transactions and digital players are doing the right thing in the way they are getting set up. So our engagement with, and the last point I shouldn't forget, there are domestic schemes that are huge in each market. Now this is where the regulator and the scheme interaction is the closest. So we actually consider our collaboration with schemes and governments as a natural extension of how we will do strategic partnerships, because we've got some things to say, we've got some ideas to express, and a lot of value to add in terms of what we have. And unless we have the governments and the domestic schemes aligned with us, that is not going to travel very far. So our government engagement, and by the way, so I'll give you two examples, right? So we took the corporate founding member of AFIN in Singapore, which you may have picked up yesterday, the ASEAN Financial Innovation Network. So that is an expression of how we want to work with government to create a larger community to galvanize, if you like, the adoption of fintech by the longer tail financial services players who may by themselves not been able to do it. So that's one example. We're working on Singapore's Business Sans Borders program, which is to allow SMEs to come together across the region to do this. We're working in Philippines to create the national retail payment system and enable BankNet in order to offer retail payments. In Singapore, we have worked with FAST. FAST works on the VocaLink real-time payment rails. In Thailand, we work with ITMX to do the same thing. So the point I'm making to you is governments, domestic schemes which are almost vehicles, and our business aspirations are not three different things. They all come together, and that's why the focus.
Hence the problem of executing, because to say that Mastercard knows payments, that's the gross understatement. You guys have been around for ages, and you guys work fast. We know this for a fact. Another fact is that startups work fast. Sadly, the third component is governments. I've never heard of government working fast. That's how they are by nature. How do you align the speed of rolling out?
So to be fair to governments, what they do is impacting a much longer term vision, right? So they don't execute small commercial outcomes.
And they shouldn't.
They shouldn't, right? So the commercial outcome conversation is reasonably fast, punchy, we're all getting together, they're not the government. The way we work with governments is to work on their agenda that they want to roll out, right? And get at a policy level approvals or frameworks that we would like to roll out in a country which needs their endorsement. And I think that is the first layer. Once you get past that, you find agencies and vehicles that will deliver to that vision which is not really garment or quasi-garment. Some garments are reasonably okay. And then you kind of work with that to pick the momentum up. But that initial layer, for example, in Philippines, we worked with the central bank, we've socialized it. So it does take, these are long haul projects. You don't build airports every year, right? You build airports once in 30 years. So some of the infrastructural projects that we go for, we consider them like airports. It's going to take a year and a half or two to get the idea consolidated, get the approvals, all of that. But then once we are in a role, the government is only interested in seeing how much upside have you created for me, which then is a question of gathering the industry and doing it.
Okay. Now we shall talk about Mastercard Express, FinTech Express. So yesterday you were talking about Express. We've covered it a bit. I did a little bit of homework last night. It was staggering, the timeline. We're talking 2 weeks and then 4 weeks for execution. It's like 6 weeks all in all together. I'm sure dozens of fintech startups are now lining up, queuing, taking a number. How did you go through the process of selecting, say, Rapid first, and then what is the selective sort of like criteria for you to select partners moving forward? Because there's going to be plenty to choose from, right?
True. And I hope there is a problem of plenty, right?
Yes.
That's not necessarily a problem. Why did I choose Rapid first? Let me frame the problem differently, right? We need players who solve multiple use cases because we are committed to the idea of digital adoption in a very widespread manner. We need players who will solve for discrete use. If everybody's solving for the same thing and they're going after each other, the upside that we can create is very limited, right? So that is one filter, if you like. The second one really to me is the same filter that a lot of investors apply, right? What's the management pool? What's the talent? What have they built? How strong is the idea? Right? And what do we think are the legs to that idea? It's a similar kind of an assessment that happens. The third thing really is how long have they been in the play and what have they delivered until now? What do we believe is the scalability of the idea, which is why when I talked about start path and late stage startups, it is one of the things that we check. What is the scalability and portability of the idea? Is a very important point because we could get consumed doing subscale projects in one market. We try and look for people with growth ambitions, with inherent scale. Some markets like Indonesia and India just offer so much domestic scale, it is okay. And I think that lastly, from a fintech perspective, to me, it is, we are not selective about picking up players. That's not what I'm saying. But we are very selective about their backgrounds because we are responsible for those transactions. The network stands promise, and we absolutely need to establish trust credentials in the fintech play. I think that's really how I would think about it.
I'm still going to pressure you on the kind of partners that you're going to have. Maybe not until 31st December, but at least in the near term. What are you looking at? You're looking at 5, 10 partners? You're looking at 100 partners? I'm repeating my question yesterday. No, because the purpose of me asking that is to give an idea. The market needs to know how are you guys going to play.
Let me answer that, right? And I'm still not going to give you a number, but I'm going to give you an idea. 3, 4, 30, 40, Ibrahim, may all be wrong numbers. The reason I say that is if you get into a market like India and I want to implement FinTech Express, you know the amount of players that it has, right? So to me, my vision over the next 2 to 3 years is to at least have 60 to 70% of fintechs work with Mastercard in some way or the other. December, that therefore becomes too early a benchmark. Remember, we've just rolled out the program. We're going to calibrate our infrastructures around the demand and how we service it and all of that. So to me, if I could get to a space where 60% of fintechs, when they have an idea and they want to solve a certain problem, whether it's a loyalty problem, whether it's an interoperability problem, whether it is a cross-border problem, they say, let me just check out what Mastercard has and let me leverage that. That's a good outcome. That's the way I'm looking at it. So for me, next year is going to be very crucial because we will hit this show on the road in all of the Asia markets.
That's crazy. The another problem that we have, sorry, I'm just going to extend my thing here. In markets in Southeast Asia, they are at different starting positions. You have underbanked population, sizable ones in, say, Indonesia and Philippines. Malaysia has a banked population of, say, 80%, very close to Singapore. So you don't see that kind of requirements needed, say, between Malaysia and Singapore versus Indonesia and Philippines. How do you play within these different markets that have different starting positions?
Again, a very good question, right? So it's not the same recipe for every market, clearly. In some markets, you try and pick the pole position players in the beginning, right? So you kind of go for those who you believe can harness about 50-60% of the transactions. So the first segment strategy really is, let's look at who are in, who have a plan, and who are reaching out to the wider consumer base than what I have been able to capture. That's the first. And in saying that, I am obviously picking for the big logos and the medium tail as opposed to the long tail. The long tail strategy is slightly different, Ibrahim. We need to work with players such as Rapid who can actually take on a lot of the long tail and the the lower end of the medium and actually house them and bring them up the curve. And that's why the question of picking somebody who's already available as a partner to pick up somebody who can't engage directly but needs that incubation zone as well.
All right. So those are just some of the short things that we can bring about from my trip here in the Singapore FinTech Festival. Maybe I'll do a longer version of this coverage when I'm back in KL. But until then, if you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to astroawani.com. Look for Notepad over there. You can also watch these kind of interviews on your mobile devices. Just download the Astro AWANI app wherever you get the application. Until then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.